Good evening, everybody. It's the regularly scheduled meeting of the Somerville Planning Board at 6:02 p.m. on September 19th, 2024. I'm Mike Capuano. I am the chairman of the Planning Board. With me tonight is Vice Chair Amelia Aboff, our clerk Jahan Habib, and members Michael McNeely and Luke Schuster. Pursuant to Chapter 2 of the Acts of 2023, this meeting of the Planning Board will be conducted via remote participation. A video recording of these proceedings will be available on the city's website or by emailing planning@somervillema.gov. This meeting is being recorded. We have a number of items on our agenda tonight. We have one item of meeting minutes. We have 3 public hearings, all 3 of which have actually requested continuances, as is my understanding. And we also have a brief discussion of the review of our standard conditions of approval. So this ought to be a fairly speedy meeting. I also know that the Patriots kick off at 8:15, so let's not go nuts. Let's take up the continuances first. We have a request from 45 Mystic Avenue to continue to the October 3rd meeting. Chair moves to continue that to October 3rd, seconded by Amelia. Steve, can we have a roll call vote, please?
Sure, this is Steve Carey. Jahan Habib. Luke Schuster.
Aye.
Michael McNeely.
Aye.
Amelia Aboff.
Aye.
And Michael Capuano.
Aye. We have a request from 71 to 72 Union Square to continue to, is it November 21st, Steve?
That is correct.
Continue to November 21st, 2024's meeting. So moved by me, seconded by Amelia. Can we have a roll call vote, please?
Jahan Habib. Jahan, you're not quite coming through on the audio. Maybe I just missed it. There it goes.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay. All right.
Luke Schuster.
Aye.
Michael McNeely.
Aye.
Amelia Aboff.
Aye.
And Michael Capuano.
Aye. And we have a request newly in from 74 Middlesex Avenue. When are they seeking a continuance to, Steve?
This is Steve Carey in the Planning Division. I don't think they've specified at this point. I know we do have a representative from the applicant's team. If you'd allow, I can promote them to panelists and they can make the request in person.
Yeah, that's fine.
Sure. I'm going to promote Darren Baird to panelist. He should be on. There he is.
Yep. Good evening. Thank you, Stephen, and good evening, Mr. Chair and members of the board. Yes, we'd look to get a continuance to the October 3rd meeting. We think between now and October 3rd, we will likely have the easement and license for maintenance executed, so it'll obviate the need for the requested amendment. And so we think, given that next couple weeks, given that the city council has approved the maintenance and license agreement and easement, that we think we should be able to get that executed in the interim and obviate the need for the amendment. So we were asking for a continuance this evening.
Yeah, that seems fine to me. Does anybody have any comments or questions of the applicant's representative? Seeing none, chair moves to continue this to October 3rd, seconded by Amelia. Steve, can we have a roll call?
Sure. Jahan Habib.
Aye.
Luke Schuster.
Aye.
Michael McNeely.
Aye.
Amelia Aboff.
Aye.
And Michael Capuano.
Aye. See you in a
Great.
few weeks.
Thank you. Go Pats.
Yeah, no kidding. We need it.
Yep.
The only other items on our agenda tonight is approval of meeting minutes, which I'll take up now. We have draft meeting minutes for August 15th, 2024. Does anybody have any comments or suggested revisions to the draft meeting minutes? I see Amelia's hand.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have one suggested edit. On the first page, item for 7172 Union Square, the second paragraph, I'd appreciate a correction saying the board, in the sentence, the board noted the transportation submissions, et cetera, that to the board's knowledge, the calculations were done with the expectation of a maximum of 18 customers per hour. Or there was
Here
a
in the planning division,
misunderstanding.
I can make that change. I just, it's, you said the second paragraph on which page?
I'm sorry, the second paragraph on the first page.
On the first page.
It currently reads, the board, that all the calculations were done with the expectations of a maximum of 18 customers per hour. I just want to note that, that's our understanding.
Sure, I can make that change.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Seeing none, the chair moves to adopt the draft meeting minutes as amended, seconded by Amelia. Steve, can you call the roll?
Jahan Habib. Luke Schuster,
Aye.
Michael McNeely,
Aye.
Amelia Aba,
Aye.
and Michael Capuano.
Aye, we have minutes. Last item on our agenda was to begin a discussion on a review of the standard and optional conditions that we impose in various circumstances. The board had wanted to kind of do an overview and see what would make sense to potentially keep, potentially add to, and potentially amend. So I think what Steve wanted to propose tonight, and I think it makes sense to kind of take these maybe one at a time, is the conditions for special permits. And he had circulated to the board an Excel spreadsheet that has a list of the conditions with different tabs in them for the different types of permits that we vote on. And he had made it something that we could edit and add to for potential discussion. So knowing that we were going to be discussing special permit conditions tonight, I added one that I thought we might want to discuss. And of course, the way I envision these discussions to be, because this is somewhat new for what we do, is to have kind of a broad-based discussion by the board of, do these conditions make sense? Is this something that if it's lawful to be included as a condition, is this something that we want to include as a condition in all cases? In some cases, on a case-by-case basis, what do we want to do here? So it's more of a beginning of a discussion that when we have ideas that we like, to run them through the appropriate departments, to get the feedback from, obviously, planning staff, kind of first and foremost, but also through other city departments that would be involved with implementation and sign off of the conditions, the legal office, of course. So that's kind of how I see this going forward. But because this is kind of a new process for us, that's obviously subject to change depending on how we think it's working, kind of as time goes on. So this is the beginning of the discussion, certainly not the end, and not a finalized process. We can kind of work collaboratively to figure out what's working and what's not. So does that make sense to everybody? So Steve, what I think might make sense is, well, so I added certain information, certain language as a draft. I don't know if anybody else had the opportunity to. I also don't know, because this is still general discussion, what the best way forward is, because these are just ideas that we have. This isn't something that was generated by city policy necessarily. These are ideas that we as individual members are coming up with. So yeah, Amelia.
Mr. Chair, I think there's sort of a twofold exercise here. I think one part is reviewing the existing standard conditions that are applied in different situations and discussion of whether all of them are still appropriate and whether there are any potential adjustments to any of them to be considered. And then there is, in addition to that, the question of new standard conditions that we might, as a board, might want to propose or raise. So I would welcome a process where we sort of review line by line as a group, even if it's just very briefly one set of these, you know, per meeting or what have you, including discussion of any new ones, but.
Yeah, maybe I didn't say it, but that was my intent, is to go through what already exists, whether we think we want to amend it, or get rid of them altogether for whatever reason, and then also discussion of potential new ones. So I thought I had mentioned that, but maybe not.
I'm sorry.
So yeah, Mike.
While we're talking about systemic questions and before we're drilling into details here, I did want to ask if this is something that could eventually roll into our ongoing regular meetings, meaning if we stumble into a specific topic that we think should become a standard for applications going forward, that maybe one of us can propose that standard be included kind of going forward perpetually. Is that something that can happen, or does this group see this as being a static milestone today?
No.
Okay.
I don't. And in fact, this is the impetus for the idea behind that subcommittee that we had discussed. And you know, whether that comes to fruition or not, presuming it does not, and we just meet as a board of the whole, I think we can always have that discussion. Now, my concern is that if we start raising issues as they come up in a meeting, that might get us into a little bit of hot water because discussion of that particular issue wouldn't have been noticed. So it might be an idea that if somebody identifies something that we might want to add as a condition, which by the way, we do all the time, you know, we add conditions and propose conditions to applications all the time. If we think, hey, this one might make sense to move forward, with similarly situated applications, that's something that we might want to flag, and maybe in that moment say, hey, Steve, can we make sure that we address this as a point of discussion at a future meeting where it can be properly noticed, and we can, potentially solicit it wouldn't be testimony because it's not a public hearing. It'll be, matters of planning board discussion. But, as one member, I would welcome in certain circumstances, the public's view on conditions, whether they're going to be current applicants, future applicants, members of the public who, would be living or working next to a building that would be subject to these conditions. So I think that would be valuable too, because we don't have all the answers. And in fact, I'm getting a call from the city of Somerville right now.
Well, thank you for flagging that notice constraint. That's a great observation. I think what I really like about this is it helps us memorialize and standardize so that we can be consistent from application to application. And it dawned on me that, I'm not going to know all the things I would like to see today, right? And so thank you for flagging that. It's probably worth having the right procedures, but I like the idea of just generally trying to put more here if we can.
Some 311 thing, I don't know. Probably more construction. Yeah, look.
Just one more process thought question about what we're undertaking, what we aren't. When we teed this up really briefly at a meeting, might have been our last meeting or 2 meetings ago, where Sarah Lewis was with us, she helped me conceptualize that there's standard conditions and some other set of conditions that we also sometimes require, but fit in another category. I'm struggling to even articulate what that other bucket is, but like there were things like the requirement for MBTA passes and blue bikes for new businesses within a half-mile transit and stuff. And I don't see that on any of these, and I think it falls into that other category. What's that other category, and should we be talking about that also?
If I may,
Yeah.
Luke, I know the condition you're referring to. I can share my screen briefly. But we have, so this is for the standard conditions for related to use special permits. So we have sort of our required tab here for conditions, you know, that are sort of required to be attached with regards to, you know, recording the decision, that something like that. And then under this depends tab, we have conditions that are sort of imposed just depending on the nature of the use. You know, how much parking is being provided or not being provided, that sort of thing. And that's where you'd find the conditions related to you know, subsidizing MBTA passes and blue bikes and that sort of thing. So I realize that the spreadsheets aren't the easiest thing to navigate, but hopefully that's clear that there are these tabs down there for required, depends, optional, and then this under review tab is where my thought was that, you know, you could put conditions you'd want to draft or talk about under here, just so we have a repository for them.
Super helpful. Thank you, Stephen. That basically answers it. So it's everything, all of it, maybe not everything, but it's more like conceptually, we're all in the spreadsheet universe. Since you've noted those, what's the difference between depends and optional?
You know, that's a great question. I think I don't have a good answer for that. I hadn't set up the spreadsheet. I'm piggybacking off the hard work of some of my colleagues, so I can get an answer for you on that. But I don't have a clear answer on that.
I'm wondering if depends is, so, you know, the required ones are clearly, you know, required in all circumstances at all times. I'm wondering if depends would be if certain criteria are met, then this becomes a requirement, and optional is just at the discretion of the planning board. I don't know if that's the intended distinction, but that's how I read it when I took the spreadsheet. Anybody else have any kind of generalized questions about this? Yeah, John. And it just to be clear, like, I don't really have a structure on this yet. I think this is more of an open discussion where we try to figure out how we want to tackle these things. So I don't have a plan per se on going forward. So, you know, any questions that people have, nobody might have an answer to it yet. So
Sure. So thank you, Mr. Chair. I think for me, the criteria and the application of any new conditions is really important. I think we should certainly pay attention to right sizing the criteria and applying it equitably for many reasons. But I think I'm really curious to see, you know, how we're going to be able to navigate through that, because you know, certainly when we're talking about criteria, there's a lot of factors that go into place. I mean, there's the dynamic market environment, there's circumstances that are unique to the city of Somerville. There's even I would say the intent of the board to support or promote certain activities like bicycle lanes and other things. But I'm just gonna be really curious to see where the conversation goes. I just want to ask my fellow board members to keep the criteria in mind, and that's all I wanted to say. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
okay. Anybody else before we dig in? So I think tonight to whet our palate on kind of how this might play out with other things. Stephen suggested, at least in the draft agenda, looking at special permits first. So I think, you know, that makes sense. I did include a proposed, you know, idea. I threw it in special permits. I don't know if this is something that we should consider throughout all the permit types that we approve. But knowing that we're going to discuss special permits tonight, I threw it in there. So Steve, if you could share your screen with the various tabs that are part of the special permits, maybe we can go through, and if you could blow it up a little bit, it's a little bit difficult for me to see.
Sure.
I think we can go through each tab as we go through, and if we have questions on why something is required, or if there's a question, I think we can kind of just jump in, and if you have the answer, or if somebody else on staff will be able to get us the answer, like why decision has to be recorded with Middlesex South Registry of Deeds. I have an idea of why that's the case. It's probably statutory. But it's something like, hey, why do we have this in here? Why is this required? And if we have an answer for it, great. If not, it would also be, I think, a good way for us to learn why we condition what we condition.
Sure. And I mean, I may not be able to answer,
No.
all
I,
things on the
I'm
spot,
not
but-
looking for a snap answer, and if it's
but
something
yeah,
that,
glad to take back a set
Especially-
of questions and get
yeah,
answers.
especially if it's something that we think doesn't make any sense or might not be applicable, there might be a reason to leave it in, and we might not have an answer for that immediately, and a good discussion on why policy reasons for including things or not, I think is ongoing and fluid. So, Steve, do you want to go through them? I think, again, trying to figure out the process.
Sure. Just each one of these lines.
Yeah, sure.
Sure.
Yeah, oh, and I'm sorry for the I don't mean to cut you off. For the clarification of me, at least, and probably other members and members of the public, what some of the abbreviations mean, like what is perpetual, then what is
Yeah.
BP, what is CO?
Yeah.
I know, but not everybody might.
Sure. Yeah. So BP is a building permit. So before a building permit can be issued. And then CO is certificate of occupancy. So before a certificate of occupancy can be issued. So the first one is a condition enforced in perpetuity, that this condition must be recorded with Middlesex South Registry of Deeds. I guess just here, let me see if I can see everyone. So if you want to raise your hand, or Michael, if you want to call on folks, if someone has a comment.
Because I'm trying to focus on the spreadsheet, I'm not always looking at the tiny box of people, so just jump in.
Second one says before a building permit will be issued, one digital copy of all required application materials reflecting any physical changes required by the board, if applicable, must be submitted to PPZ for public record. Materials must be submitted in accordance with the document format standards of the relevant submittal requirements. Also, before a building permit, a digital copy of the recorded decision stamped by the Middlesex South Registry of Deeds must be submitted to PPZ for the public record. And then the last one is before certificate of occupancy, a written narrative or a descriptive checklist identifying the completion or compliance with permit conditions must be provided to ISD at least 10 working days in advance of a request for a final inspection.
Can I ask a question on that one?
Sure.
What happens if, because there have been certain circumstances and certain applications where ISD clearly has signed off on the adherence to the planning board's conditions, but in the planning board's opinion, they have not.
Gotcha.
So I'm wondering if, and I didn't include it in under review, but I'm actually wondering if going forward, can we also receive a copy of the applicant's written narrative talking about the conditions? Because there are sometimes conditions that we impose that are done because they were contentious. So if
Sure.
an applicant says, yeah, I did this thing, and ISD says, yeah, it looks like you did this thing, but we look at it as like, no, this is not what we intended. Because we don't have oversight over ISD, but we do have oversight over our conditions. I'm wondering if and the thing the one I'm thinking about is the fake brick that was put in on a particular building where we had intended actual full brick, and ISD had signed off on it because I think in their opinion brick was brick. And the building looks like crap, and people were disappointed with the way the building turned out, and I completely agreed with them.
Mr. Chair?
Yeah.
Can I ask, whether you're imagining that's something that happens in parallel, and if there were an issue that the board identified that would be something that we brought up after the fact, because I think it would probably add a burdensome layer of process. I'm just wondering about what your thoughts are on the timing, I guess.
Yeah, no, I think you're right? Because I don't want to have to review all checklists for all the applications that we permit. But I think we might be able to identify in advance if we approve a project with a particular condition that we care about, whether it's trees, whether it's brick, whether it's any number of things that are of concern to us and the public in particular, we might say specifically on this one. I'm wondering if that would be an optional or it depends condition, where if there's a particularly contentious condition, that we call that out in advance as a condition, saying, hey, for this very particular application, we care about this item. We would like to double check before C of O is issued to make sure that ISD has interpreted our expectations correctly before they act. I'm wondering if that's something that might capture what you're looking at. And something that I don't know if we can do that, but if they're already having to give ISD a list of saying, here's how we complied, if there's something that we've identified in advance during the permitting process, then I think we should take a look at conditions of note.
Mr. Chair, just one clarifying question.
Mhm. Yeah.
So you're suggesting that in rare circumstances where we apply this additional condition, the CO would not be released until we approved and confirmed. You're not talking about like pulling back or revoking a CO, right?
No, because this would happen in advance of the CO.
Okay, got it. So it would be an additional step, just used very rarely.
Yeah, I mean, I can think of a handful of conditions that the planning board has imposed over the last several years that were important to us for a variety of reasons. And there have been some circumstances where, in the planning board's opinion, or in the individual member's opinion who cared about the particular condition that was imposed, that it wasn't followed to the intent and the expectation of the board. I can think of a few off the top of my head. I'm sure you all can too. So instead of having ISD not really know what we mean with a contentious condition, if we can also say, yep, okay, this looks like what we intended, and if ISD also then approves it on their own, there we go. But I'd like to have some oversight on the implementation of the conditions that we put in. Yeah, Amelia.
Mr. Chair, I know the types of projects that you're talking about, and sort of I think I understand what you're aiming for here, but I have to admit this sounds like a substantial obstacle that could come in the way of projects getting open. And sort of I know all the steps that lead up to the milestone of getting to a C of O, and having an additional, what would feel a little bit discretionary step of sort of confirming that a condition was met as it was envisioned by a zoning board, years earlier, feels like it has the potential to create a point of friction that would worry me a little bit, even though I hear your intent and I don't disagree with the intent. I do wonder if this is something where like there could be a staff review from P&Z to ensure something was meeting the intent of the board or something that? Can we do, is there anything we can think of that meets your goal, but is a little bit less process intensive?
So I don't know. The concern that I have is a mitigating issue is I think this is going to happen exceedingly rarely. You know, like I said, I've been on the board for a number of years. I can think of probably 4 things that would have fallen into this category over, 15 years. So I don't think this is something that the planning board, I don't intend, if this is something that we can do, to review. With every application or even, one a meeting. I think this is something that we might want to look at, and we can talk about how would we envision this going? Because my concern is that maybe staff doesn't even necessarily recognize what the planning board envisioned. And I don't want to put any more burden necessarily on staff either, knowing that everybody's overworked already. So I just want some oversight over the important conditions that we usually negotiated by members of the board with the applicant in conjunction with, and oftentimes discussion with the neighborhood. Like for example, the one I'm thinking of right now is the tree condition that you have been concerned about, Amelia, about protecting trees and whether those are done sufficiently, and what oversight does the planning board have if the tree dies. We can't say after the fact, hey guys, they screwed that up. But before C of O is issued, if we can go in, and if the tree has died, we might be able to ask those questions. What steps did you take? Do we have the sign off of the city arborist and things like that? Because that was an important condition to the planning board and to the people of the neighborhood. And why wasn't this condition sufficient? Because if ISD or somebody else looks at it and says, I don't know, they said they did the best they could, that might not be real. That might not be right. And that could be a concern.
So, Mr. Chair, I agree. The thing I'm struggling with is, and this, I know this is just sort of the beginning of an idea, so we can work through all of this, but
Yeah, it is.
But as I think about it, you're right, there have been only a couple of instances where like the final condition has diverged from the intention in a way that was meaningful and problematic. But this condition would have to be layered onto everything. There's no way to pre-filter for the problematic one. So if you put this condition on every project that had brick, that would capture a ton, right? So every project with a tree protection plan. So it's an interesting puzzle of sort of how you apply it in a limited set of circumstances, I guess.
Yeah, the tree one is, I think, a little bit broader because I think we would expect to protect trees to the maximum that we can in all applications, right? So yeah, maybe it doesn't. I don't know. This is why I'm glad we're having this discussion, right? Is what do we want to do and what makes sense to do and how can we actually achieve it? And this is kind of why I wanted to have this discussion the way it's happening. Is, gee, I know what I want, but I don't know how to articulate it. So maybe we can put this on Steve, like if we want to put this specific issue on a future discussion and have some feedback from staff in a later meeting on, here are the ideas that the planning board has had. How does staff envision something like this would work? I think that would be helpful too.
Sure. And I think, if we had notice, it's also something we could discuss internally as staff, just so we're clear on sort of what our position on it is.
Right. I'm glad we're having this type of discussion. This is what I was hoping we could do, and figuring out how the board can, be more effective and more efficient and a better board for projects that come before us that impact neighborhoods and communities.
I wonder if there's not, I've never seen the kind of checklist that ISD would get as a result of this condition, but I wonder if part of it might be the devil in the details of like what is in that narrative or the descriptive checklist. Like, is it sufficiently descriptive and would that help? In any
Yeah,
way?
Steve, can we get one?
Sure, I'd be, yeah, I'd glad to ask ISD to provide a, an example of one from a recent project. That'd be helpful.
Yeah, it would be, particularly when the planning board has approved, knowing that we've had discussion and expectations. Amelia's right. I want to see what this looks like to make sure I'm not putting something, putting an extra burden on something that is already detailed and burdensome. Anybody else? Yeah, Michael. Feel free to
So
just jump in. Just jump in.
Okay.
It's an open discussion.
Appreciate that. Appreciate that. So I, for one, as one member, do appreciate the idea of flagging and highlighting and adding extra scrutiny to a very sensitive project. So for what it's worth, I think it's definitely worth continuing that dialogue. As I was thinking through the discussion a bit here, one thing that I think is important to consider, not just for this topic, but the rest of the topics this evening, is whether or not this could create an artificial red flag for financing of projects. I can imagine a world where I might raise capital for another type of project in another, city, where the financiers might be concerned about a non-ministerial, review of a particular condition, and suddenly all of my investment is just kind of, blown up essentially, right? So maybe one thought for some of these topics is to focus more on the like building permit or earlier stages of review, just so that we're not artificially making financing more challenging. Because the feedback I've been hearing lately has been that financing has been one of the harder things for stimulating development in the city, and that's definitely something I want to be sensitive and thoughtful about.
That's a great point.
Excellent. Awesome. Anybody else on any of the required conditions? All right.
Does ISD review, like, would it be reasonable? What is, ISD is already issuing building permits, but are they issuing them with a sort of full focus on permit conditions? Would having that narrative at the building permit stage be a layer that could help? If the issue is just ISD not understanding the intent, that's one thing. I'm just wondering if there's a gap in the process that for future discussion.
What else?
All right, so I can move on to the next tab here, the Depends tab.
Depends. Oh, a lot of depends.
Yeah, so I'll just
Steven.
go through these and jump in if one catches your interest. So these are all largely, the timeline for these is something that's enforced in perpetuity. So one being
Steve.
on and off-site accessory parking is prohibited.
Steve, can you hear me? Sorry,
Yes,
this is Luke trying to jump in quickly. Is it all right if I jump in with a thought / question about the depends category before we go into them one by one?
sure.
And it gets back to what we mean by depends and optional, I guess, but specific to depends here. A couple of these in passing when considering cases over the last year or so have been referenced as standard conditions that we always have. And I interpreted that as not fully mandatory, but our practice was to do them for all applicable similar cases. But I'm noticing that these are all in the depends tab. And if they really are just sort of like a menu of options for us to consider, the nature of the discussion about these might be pretty different than if we actually think many of these we want to apply to all cases of a similar sort. So I think that might be an important distinction for us to wrestle with before we do with them one by one, if I'm making sense.
My understanding is that these are, depends based on the, categorically by type, as is made a little bit more clear in columns to the right. And that they're standard within a business category. I may be mistaken.
I think that's, I think that's accurate.
So actually, can we, in case this is helpful, let's take one of them as a, for instance, the blue bikes and MBTA one. Is every time we've talked about that recently only been connected to a cannabis retail sales? Maybe that's true. I hadn't realized that thinking about them in hindsight. I thought it was more like all ones within half mile of transit or something.
Well, this is
Now we're
all table of special permits. Sorry, I'm gonna try to explain to the best of my knowledge, and Steve, please correct me, but this is a table of special permit conditions specific to uses. And there aren't that many uses, there aren't that many special permits that come to us for a change for a special permit use. So it would be this, or it would be like a residential use in a certain zone within the city. So most of the use cases that we see happen to be cannabis retail sales, because it's one of the small number of things that are in our purview that are in this broader category. Like there are no other, I can't think of any other commercial business types that require a special permit for use. Steve might have them.
I apologize. I was writing a note to a colleague. Could you repeat the question?
No problem. I was just saying, Luke had raised the question of sort of why are we seeing these only in association with cannabis retail sales? And I was pointing out that I think that cannabis retail sales are virtually the only type of commercial use that requires a special permit from the planning board. I know if I go into the table there, into the use table, there are a handful of others, but we don't see them very frequently. I think like cannabis cultivation would be another one that's a special
Sure.
permit use. But otherwise,
they-
we've seen this for residential uses in certain districts where residential isn't as of right.
Right, I know the planning board also has special permits relative to sections of the city we've designated as pedestrian streets. And within that area, there's certain uses that are subject to a special permit, like I think fitness centers that are on a pedestrian street. But yeah, I think it's, in terms of use, I would say the cannabis retail sales is probably definitely the most frequent one that comes up.
Thanks. Thanks,
Yeah.
Amelia and Steve. That's very helpful. So these are all, okay, I feel good about going one off on these now.
All right, so the next several are ones on the topic of mobility. That actually sort of came up in our discussion around 7172 Union Square recently. So entity name shall commit to annual monitoring and reporting of the appointment only recreational marijuana operations model. The annual report shall include at least the following information: statistically valid travel survey of employees and customers, a status update on the implementation of all TDM measures, TDM being transportation demand management. The next one, any change to the means of sale requires a new TIS. The scope of the TIS must be approved by the director of mobility. Entity name shall post information about non-vehicular services available in the area on the website and in materials posted at the store. Entity name shall provide a transit screen or its substantial equivalent displaying real-time MBTA and bike share information in location, for example, with the commercial space, within the commercial space in a location that is visible by pedestrians outside the storefront display windows. Entity shall provide incentives to customers who take non-vehicular or public transportation modes to the site. Entities shall provide 100% subsidized Blue Bikes public bike share memberships subject to annual rate increases. Entities shall provide 100% subsidized MBTA passes or up to the federal maximum qualified transportation fringe benefits for current US Internal Revenue Code, $270 per month in 2021, subject to annual increases. Retail sales to walk-in customers are prohibited. Customer visits must be by appointment only. Approval is limited to the entity name and not transferable to any successor in interest. And this permit is valid subject to entity name having fully executed an active host community agreement with the city of Somerville. So, yeah, as we noted, these are largely related to cannabis retail sales.
Stephen, could I ask
Thanks.
you to pause for a second? Could we
Yeah.
back to line number 7, please?
Sure.
I think we should reconsider this one. I think the intention of this is good, but I think we've heard from cannabis retailers in these conversations that there are in fact very strict regulations around discounting products or otherwise like providing incentives for the products that are sold at cannabis dispensaries. And I'm not sure that if we've written a condition that's basically like you have to give your patrons a sticker if they took the bus, I'm not sure that is meaningful. And I think it may be marginally at odds with regulations that are under the state cannabis regulation. So I don't know enough about this to know if it is or isn't an issue, but it's one that through conversations with applicants, I've thought may be worth reconsidering.
Right, I remember having that discussion with a few applicants, and they're like, so you can't give me discounted weed, but what can you give me? And it's usually something that's not terribly impressive, and not an incentive necessarily. I'm not going to take a bus so I can get a lollipop.
I agree. I'll say also, this actually is really helpful for me to see all of these side by side sort of stacked up against each other. And just a related observation I have, and I really have no specific horse in the cannabis retail sales race, I swear. But it feels like just like almost like a Christmas wish list of things we're adding on. Maybe because we can and just have the leverage because they're the things that require the special permit. And I'm thinking about horizontal equity concerns, like why should someone running a cannabis store in Lagoon Square have to do all these things, but not someone running a liquor store right next to it? What is the logic even behind how these came to be? I mean, I get setting aside the appointment only. I know that's a sort of was a separate idea behind that, but why should a cannabis store have to pay for the MBTA pass of its employee, but not the liquor store? It's just
So we actually do impose that to certain other businesses in transit zones too. It just so happens that this tends to come up with cannabis retail uses because we've seen so goddamn many of them.
So do we
There
think
may be
in
some
practice
conditions that, I'm sorry.
No, go for it, Amelia.
There may be some conditions, I'm just trying to cross check, but I'm not sure I can do it live on the spot. There may be some conditions that appear here for special permits relating to use that appear elsewhere for special permits relating to the building. I'm not sure. Because the fundamental permit that they are in front of us for varies when we're talking about buildings that are within a certain distance of a transit area. Is that right? I don't want to lie.
I don't know.
Sorry, I never mind. I don't have it. I don't have the receipt for that right now.
And
Well,
look,
reaction just generally to my observation across the board, like any one of these things feels good, but do we really, should we really be requiring this? You know, so often, and are we doing it in a way that feels fair to other similar, but just not happening to be cannabis businesses?
hey, Sarah.
Could I make a suggestion that since we are at a very interesting pause point with I don't know if it's a moratorium, but there's a hold on applications for cannabis uses coming through, that this might be a qualifying event that would allow us to revisit these so that it still is consistent within our processes and procedures? And if so, would we want to create an agenda item specifically diving into this block of items and whether or not to strike them, for example, collectively?
So I see Sarah joined us. I'd like to get her thoughts on some of this. If you want to share them.
Absolutely. Just might have to catch me up a little bit. I'm sorry. So we're talking about the mobility requirements for cannabis uses?
Like, yes, yeah. And is there a specific reason that they tend to apply exclusively to cannabis uses? Should we keep them? Is there a reason to keep them? Is there a staff, preference and planning purpose to keeping them?
I mean, as we've talked about before, sort of the timing of these were set up originally because we didn't know what to expect. So I think there is a conversation that we can have internally about moving forward. And I like Michael's observation about the moratorium in place right now. It probably does give us a starting point. So I would like to talk to mobility and understand where they're coming from as we move forward. The other thing I want to be careful of is what requirements are actually state related, how much of these are tied to, I fully will admit, I don't fully understand what the licensing commission can condition and what we can condition normally for the physical side of things, obviously. But in what realm does the Cannabis Control Commission dictate some of these elements is what I'm not sure of as to how much is required by us versus the state. That is something we can follow up on.
Yeah, I think that would be helpful, so we can at least have a basis on which to kind of view these conditions. Is this something that the CCC or the Department of Public Health or whoever it might be imposes, or is this something that we just decided to do while we were trying to figure out how to bring cannabis uses into the city, and now we have a much clearer idea of what we're doing, and maybe we can revisit these.
I'm making myself a note right now.
Just since we're here, I like the idea that this moment when the moratorium ends and there's gonna be another round. So I think that sounds right. Just since we're on this, Sarah, I'd be curious if you have a best guess on the fly answer to my question about, are some of these sorts of requirements being applied to most other businesses in our transit areas? And it's okay if it's hard to answer on the fly.
Yeah, it's hard to answer on the fly. There's a lot of things where there are requirements for businesses above a certain size to provide subsidized T-passes and things like that. So there are some of those mobility management issues that come up with other businesses, but I think a lot of this, they're not always because cannabis was sort of a new thing and is identified specifically in the ordinance, is where the specific requirements came from, as best as I can recall. You are talking to somebody who has a horrible memory.
Sure.
Anything else on these before we head to the other issues on pens? Let's continue with the pens then. Steve.
Sure.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. Your insight on it.
Steve, before you move on to 13, I just had a quick question on 12. So this is just so I understand, it's basically requiring that someone does execute a host community agreement, but it doesn't necessarily get into the details. Does the board have the ability to kind of see some of those details and kind of understand what the depth is behind those agreements in any way?
Submitting an HCA would be, I think submitting the HCA is part of sort of what we would consider a complete, application package for this special permit. It would require them to submit that executed HCA. So that theoretically should be in the application materials that the board reviews.
I'm sorry, I withdraw this question. I'm thinking of a community benefits agreement that would be signed with a local neighborhood association. So never mind. I take it back.
Gotcha.
As an aside, I can also share that I think there, as part of the moratorium, the whole host community agreement is likely changing anyway as we move forward, because the CCC has changed some of their rules and it can all be handled by licensing, I believe. So there's going to be a significant amount of changes, which is sort of why I like the let's revisit it now idea.
All right. Hopping into line item 13. So this is one that's required, would be required before a building permit was issued. Subject to all Massachusetts state law and Code of Massachusetts regulations, storefront display windows must provide an unobstructed view by pedestrian into the waiting area of the cannabis retail sales commercial space. This next one is before certificate of occupancy. The entity name shall install a bike corral containing a maximum of X bicycle parking spaces or its substantial equivalent within 300 feet of X street. Final location design must be approved by the Director of Mobility. This one is before building permit. Entity name shall submit an updated transportation access plan subject to review and approval by the Director of Mobility, which identifies a loading zone within 300 feet of X street sufficient to serve the largest delivery vehicle type anticipated for this use. Next one is before certificate of occupancy, a minimum of X off-street motor vehicle parking spaces must be dedicated to customers of this establishment during business hours, inclusive of any rideshare spaces. The parking spaces must be provided either on-site or at an off-site accessory parking lot within 300 feet of the address. These last two are would apply in perpetuity. Entity name shall direct all deliveries to occur outside of specific timeframes to every extent practicable. And then lastly, as voluntarily committed to in the transportation impact study, this is, I think, kind of open-ended for the board to fill in as they'd like.
Am I right? These last from 14 down, they actually are different from the categorical depends, then it would get triggered. These really are just a menu of options.
Yeah.
So maybe
Yeah.
here, we should just remember that we have them as options.
if I can weigh in, I'm gonna say yes. So to the best of my knowledge, for example, the line 16 was used once in relation to a cannabis retailer that was proposed on Central Street. And for those of you who know where Central and Highland meet, there's the parking lot catty corner that's actually across Highland that is parking for some of those businesses. So that one came from a specific applicant. And so they're in the depends category because there may be other situations where we might want to condition something similar.
I can just jump in for a sec, Sarah. We had a question earlier that I was unable to answer about the difference between depends and optional as the categories of these conditions. Do you have any insight on how the differentiation there?
That's a very good question. I think the optional are sort of more rare to be used, and the depends was more about specific circumstances. But to be honest, I don't quite recall.
No, that's helpful. I couldn't recall either. But I think your explanation sounds correct.
John, just jump in, man.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm just curious about line 13, and this is just for my own understanding. I read the condition language. I'm just trying to understand the intent behind it. What exactly is being achieved by having an unobstructed view by pedestrians into the waiting area? I'd love to get some thoughts from whether Stephen or Sarah on this, if there's any history behind it.
I
can
think the
give you-
idea is activation. Is that right, Sarah?
Yeah, I can give you a little bit. So originally the Cannabis Control Commission didn't want any views basically into any, because sort of visual of the product, or was thought to be inciting further use. And so where we have requirements for activated uses, Steve is exactly right. So the idea that the waiting room might be the only place that you could actually see people coming and going.
I see. That makes a lot of sense. Thank you. Thank you for explaining.
Anything else on depends? From one non-mandatory tab to the next.
All right,
Sarah,
so
can I go on the record and say that I've always felt awkward about the depends tab, just for the record.
Is
So
it
we have-
because you think that they are optional, or you think that they should be permanent?
Oh, it has nothing to do with the conditions. I just don't like the association that comes with the word.
They can be crappy.
I apologize to the entire board for going there. That was a total setup.
Yeah, you teed me right up.
all right, we have two conditions under the optional tab here, both perpetual in their time frame. Approval is limited to applicant name and is not transferable to any successor in interest. And then hours of operation are limited to prescribed hours of operation. I think these actually did appear on the previous tab. And a different, yeah, we have that here. And hours of operation are limited to, I think here we just had it more specified based on I believe these are timeframes that are set out by the Cannabis Control Commission in terms of when dispensaries can be open that can't be overridden by localities is my understanding. So I think having it here on the optional tab is just so that it you know is you know could be applied more generally to other uses if the board was inclined to limit hours of operation.
Yeah, Steve, I think that's right, because I can recall going far back that there have been other uses. I recall like a comedy club use or something where we found this condition necessary that fell outside the bounds of the cannabis use.
Those make sense as optional. I mean, at least.
Great. And then under the under review tab, we have just the one that
This is me.
Michael drafted. Yep.
Do you want me to explain what my thought process was here?
Sure.
Okay. So one of the things that has bothered me for a long time is we give an applicant, when you give an applicant a permit, and then they sit on the thing forever, whether it's in no form of completion or it's in some form of half constructed. I can think of 2 projects that we had issued, top of my head, for which we had issued permits, and the building just never got built. Or it's been in a stage of partial construction to the point where it's I think it's somewhat of a blight on the neighborhood. So in trying to avoid that, one of the thoughts that I had was putting a deadline clock on the validity of the permit. On if you don't complete something or a substantial portion of something, I threw 50% in, but obviously that's, just a number that I threw in typing this up. If you don't complete at least this by a certain period of time, then we should deem your permit abandoned and void, and you don't get to do it anymore. You don't get to hold up absolutely nothing in the middle of a neighborhood or in the middle of a commercial district because you don't want to build it or any other reasons. And by the way, so what I also said is that's a little draconian. Let's give you the option to extend an otherwise deemed abandoned permit. So come in if you are having difficulty getting financing, if your workers have walked off the job, things that would have precluded you from completing things. Come to us, give us good cause as to why we should extend your permit, and we will do it. And then you got to complete another 50% by the next 2 years or whatever it's going to be. And if you still can't get it done, come back to us, because I'm so sick of seeing projects that are just not done, not completed, not even begun. There were a couple of projects where I've had friends and family and neighbors say, "Hey, I thought you did something on this site. What the heck happened?" And my answer is, "Well, I don't know. Can't do anything about it. They're just going to sit there." And that's silly. That's a slap in the face to, I think, the city who wanted something to be done at a particular project, to the neighbors who have to sit there and look at a construction zone for 15 years. And I'm trying to figure out a way that we can hit them back where it matters. So that was the intent of this. And I don't know if people have thoughts. The one that, and this is the subject of an email exchange that I had with Steve a few weeks ago. The one that really triggered this was the boutique hotel that has been in partial construction at the corner of Beacon Street and Somerville Avenue for about 400 years. That permit was issued by the ZBA back when the planning board was still an advisory board to the ZBA, which had which hasn't been the case in at least 10 years. They put up a couple of beams. It was my understanding at one point, because I had asked about the construction, they said that it was also the same construction team that was building the condos next to the Super Stop and Shop. So they didn't have enough people to do both projects at once. Well, those condos have been, inhabited for a number of years now, and the hotel building is still, laying fallow with no operation and, seeming like no forward movement at all. That was the one that I drive by all the time and really gets under my skin. Because I'd like them to rip it down if they're not going to build it, and we can figure out what else we want to do with that site. The other one that comes to mind is Patsy's over on Lower Broadway. We had a permit that we had granted them. They ended up, I think, selling the building to somebody else who decided they wanted to change the conditions of the permit and the size of the building and the number of units and the number of windows. And they were effectively going to be putting extra bedrooms in and calling them living rooms. The neighborhood got mad, and we got mad, and we had the applicant. I said to the applicant, I recall, some of you may have been on the board at the time, saying, "You have a permit. Why aren't you using it? Like this would be a great project. Why aren't you doing what the neighborhood and we and your original owner wanted to do?" And they sat on it, and the building, to my knowledge, is still undeveloped. I would like to yank that permit. I would like to render that project completely useless to that owner. And I would like somebody else to take it over who will do something with it. So I want to cudgel. Yeah, Amelia.
I think one thing that, once again, I think I agree with you in concept, but I think this has a lot of potential tripwires as it relates to like financing and construction contracting and projects that are actively under construction. So I want to raise a consideration about sort of whether this applies to things that are under construction slowly and badly, like the Beacon Street Hotel, or whether it is about things that haven't pulled a building permit to begin the construction of the project for the special permit, because I think one of those might be easier managed than the other. The second thing I'd just like to say is one of the things that drives developers to pursue something via a special permit pathway as opposed to via a variance is like the relative certainty that once they have the permit, it will be good for a while and won't be appealed. And I would hate for us to do something that accidentally drove projects more to pursue variances, because I think that there are certainly projects we've seen that could choose either path, and I think that our board is better suited to review some of these more complex types of developments.
Yeah, that might make sense for sure. That's one of the reasons that I tried to put the escape valve of asking for an extension on, so that there isn't a final deadline. It is revoked. It is void. Your project is now, your land is now valueless. I was trying my intent behind the drafting, and obviously this is a very rough draft that I typed up in somewhat haste, was to make sure that people moved along to the reasonable extent that they could. If you can't get financing during COVID or whatever it was, or any other reason why folks aren't necessarily getting financing, that's an explanation. Come to us, say, hey, we're having a really tough time. The market has, experienced a downturn. Nobody's financing lab anymore. Whatever the situation is, right? By the way, I love the fact that we permitted 2 labs across the street from each other, and neither of them are, moving forward. It's that type of thing. It's why aren't you moving forward with what we gave you the permission to do? And if you need an extension, if you really think it's going to be, another, year or so, they need to get your feet under you, the planning board can give you that. But if you're just sitting there and, letting it be a, tax shelter or something, I'm going to assume that you're not going to move forward with the project that we spent time, energy, and money reviewing and permitting.
If this becomes something that requires a lot more nuance and discussion to shape into a form that is acceptable, I would just also like to put out there in the spirit of your question that a condition that created, like effectively a reporting requirement that didn't have the threat of something being revoked, might be an easier first step in this direction for consideration. I know that wouldn't have the same cudgel effect, but it might have it might provide some context.
It might, but I also don't think it would facilitate the end goal that at least I foresee is really being able to penalize bad actors and lazy actors. And just simply having them have a reporting requirement coming and say, yep, we're still thinking about it. Yep, we're still working on it. Yep, I don't know, the market's still down. Well, that doesn't do anything for us. So, to the extent that we can, I would like to have some sort of a penalty option as well to hit bad actors, because there are a few, and then noticeable. And they're in some pretty visible areas of major commercial areas. The fact that the entire strip of stores on Elm Street, that's been at issue, that many of them closed down thinking that another building was going to be built, and then it wasn't, that's a problem too.
Yeah, I just don't want to, I think we just need to be careful to not do something that will chill development, is the prospect of a special, like, you understand the angle I'm afraid of.
I do.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, if I may.
Yeah. Oh, Sarah.
So there's a couple of pieces here that we need to throw into the mix. First of all, I'm going to sort of say the obvious. Under state law, it is the building official who has the authorization to apply fines or violations of non-compliance with any permit. Where my brain is racing right now, I understand where you're coming from and what the intent is here, because I've talked to a lot of the merchants in your example of Davis. We've been having meetings with them fairly regularly. I'm going to play out a scenario. So let's say, to Amelia's point, we say, okay, it's a reporting thing. You have to come back and tell us what's going on. That is a condition that doesn't readily have a trigger for either PPZ or ISD to be able to go back and look at it. So it'd almost be a condition on perhaps the building permit rather than the planning board's work. And I'm speculating, and I'm trying to think this through as we're talking about this. And so obviously I'd like to talk to ISD and legal about this, but I do understand your concerns and where this is coming from, because there are some eyesores that, and I think there's a difference between the projects that haven't even started construction because of the financing side of it, or sort of they got a permit for any number of political reasons, and perhaps now that direction has changed. Whereas the construction eyesores, or in places where sort of demolition has occurred, and I think of that as a construction eyesore, that there's actually no forward motion. I think there's sort of a difference between the two there, as we can as we need to think about them, because sort of, and I was thinking of Amelia's comments of sort of within the the development world. There are different points. For, one has theoretical financing, and then, sort of one does not. If they've started construction, you hope they've got their, sort of their funding ducks in a row, although it may be different sources. I think there's a lot here to unpack, but I understand the concept of what you're trying to achieve. Steve, I think this is going to be a biggie for us.
Frankly, I hope it is. I'd love to be able to get something done that we can achieve, because frankly, I'd like to knock that hotel thing down and just have it be an abandoned gas station again. At least nobody's got their hopes up. Another question that I would have, Sarah, and I don't expect an answer now, obviously, because I'm brain farting it now. Is there a condition that we can say, if it doesn't happen, ISD should look at imposing a fine or doing something? Is there an instructive thing where if the planning board doesn't have the authority to do it, we can instruct ISD to consider certain actions?
I will, I'm adding that to this list. And I don't have an answer for that right now. I mean, anything I say would be speculation, and
Yeah, of course. No. Like I said, that we're all just kind of having an open-ended discussion, knowing that, the answer is not likely going to happen immediately. And the other one, obviously, I'm thinking of, because I live around the corner, is the Teal Square Pit. They used to be Kikalu. Nothing's gone on that since, I bought this house in 2007. I think it burned down in 2011. And it was remediation issues, and we didn't know what we wanted. Then we needed to change the zone. Then, well, it's been 15 years, guys. Just make it a swimming pool.
Yeah, I will caution one thing too. The property owners are allowed to do or not do with their properties as, sort of as they see fit. Where it becomes blight or a public hazard, I think that's probably a little piece of this conversation too that will be worth investigating with legal.
I think there are a lot of levers that are available to a multitude of stakeholders. So this was my draft condition. Obviously, I knew this was a very, early idea of something. Happy to have a discussion on it, or anybody else's thoughts.
If I may chime in, at first glance, when I first saw this pop up, I was really excited about it. I like the idea of holding people's feet to the fire, especially because our city's resources are scarce, right? And if developers are going to ask our team to invest lots of time and effort and review, I think we should make sure that they're stepping up to the plate and following through. Having said that, and again, just sharing thoughts out loud, I am a little bit nervous that this makes development that much riskier. It's one thing for a developer to say, okay, I'm willing to put a bunch of capital and time at risk to get to that, permit bogey. It's another thing for me also to have the ability to view into the future of financing and construction risks that can occur. And perhaps your pressure relief valve of the 6-month extension parameter is sufficient to keep that risk at bay, but then we need to be very clear about it being an easy hurdle in that instance, or I am worried that it could send a cooling signal to developers. Like they need to know it's a slam dunk, or they're going to get nervous, I think. Just again, thinking at first glance. But on the flip side of that, like again, I very much believe that we should have the right to ask for something in return if we're going to dedicate city time to support applications like this.
Awesome. Yeah. Like I said, initial conversations. This one I think will have a long road ahead of it, irrespective of what comes of it. But I think this is the benefit of having this type of an item on the agenda, so that we can bat around ideas like this. Because if all of you said, Mike, what is wrong with you? Okay, maybe an idea is bad. Maybe some of you have different ideas that are great or are not so good. We're all on this board because we care about the city and we care about how the city is developed and neighborhoods are developed. And we're all thoughtful, well-meaning people. So that's why I'm glad I get to meet with all of you and count you all as colleagues and friends, so we can kind of work together in figuring out how to do this better. That's it on my end. Anybody else? No? Okay. Maybe next meeting or some meeting in the future, we can move on to a different permit type, or maybe we can continue our discussion on some of the issues that we raised tonight. Obviously, we didn't have a heavy agenda for items other than this, which I think was good, because we get to dig into the weeds on this stuff a little bit, and try to figure out a process of how we want to work on it. So
If I can jump in for a sec,
Yeah.
just looking ahead at what the agendas look like for October, both the 3rd and the 17th appear to have relatively light agendas, just compared to what the board has had in the past. So if you did want to take that opportunity to have a meeting similar to this one where we tackle another one, I just wanted to give that heads up that yeah, the agenda is relatively light.
yeah, I mean, let's I think it's a good point. Let's leave it as a permanent agenda item. And if we get to it, we get to it. If we don't, we don't.
Sure. And if you want to make the agenda item be something more specific in terms of relating to a specific condition or a specific block of conditions, I think we could make that be what's reflected on the agenda, if that is something that you want to sort of alert the public to.
Yeah, I'm wondering if that makes sense after we've kind of gone through each of the permit types and identified the areas that we want to dig into. Because I don't know what I want to talk about for other things until we do. Like even tonight, the required condition on special permits was not something that I had thought of until we had this meeting. So yeah, I mean,
Speaking as one member, I would find it helpful if, whether it's noticed on the agenda or just by email to us, we have some direction from staff about like which of the spreadsheets, which topic of things we are addressing in a given meeting, because I can't retain all of the detail that I want to talk about all of them. So I think this was all on uses. I think Steve had suggested the next one up might be buildings. Whether it's that one or another one, if we can try to at least know which one we would talk about, I would personally find that helpful.
yeah, I think the email that was sent to us said something along the lines of, might make sense to start with special permits. So something along those lines. Maybe we just go down the list of tabs or of spreadsheets.
Sure, we could do the building conditions, the site plan approval conditions associated with the approval of buildings, which is one of the 5 spreadsheets, if that works for the board.
Sure.
I see Michael McNeely has his hand
Oh,
raised.
yeah. McNeely, go for it.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can I just make one last inquiry about the cannabis requirements and whether or not we want to do something for that particular block? The reason I want to bring it back up is I also want to ask what the timeline is on that moratorium, such that we're able to address this before that moratorium ends.
I will check on that date. I'm pretty sure it was at least a year, if not 18 months. And I think we're only about 6 months into it. So we do have time on
And I
that,
just-
but I will clarify that date for you.
I just would remind the board, we do have, there is one more dispensary coming down the pipe that has a executed HCA that was prior to that moratorium. So they haven't completed their application yet, but I think they are in the process. So there is one more that the board will be reviewing before that.
Please
yeah,
tell me it's not in Davis Square.
It's not in Davis Square. It's, I believe, over somewhere more East Somerville is my recollection.
I'm
And
glad
just to
you-
clarify for my colleagues, I don't mean to change anything for the applications that are in flight. I think what I'm proposing is revisiting those standard conditions for the next tranche. So, yeah.
Anybody else? Seeing no other business before the planning board, I want to thank
Sorry.
everybody for, I think,
Sorry, Michael,
Yeah.
I apologize.
Yeah.
I did have some just other business I wanted to raise quickly, which was just the idea of asking staff at a subsequent meeting to provide, if they're up for this and it's not a heavy lift, a quick update on development activity post the MBTA communities plan that we passed. There was some interesting news coverage that I know several of us saw. It seems like there has been some triple decker activity following that change. And I just would be curious for just a really quick update from planning staff about how they think implementation's going. If that news coverage is accurate, that there's been a little bit of an uptick that's following the plan the city passed. And then relatedly on my mind is when we were part of the discussion, making our recommendation to the city council on this, we talked about how we might also want to consider other changes to the inclusionary policy after we learn a little bit through implementation, like the consideration of maybe adding the possibility of a fourth unit if it's affordable, since currently there isn't that requirement anymore. So this just could be a good moment to start thinking about that. Not particularly urgent, but it's on my mind.
If I may, what's interesting is we will have to get somebody from ISD to come talk about that, only because us within PPZ, part of the MBTA communities, removed a lot of those. Those basically became by right projects, so they go immediately to building permit. So we don't necessarily have, we're not involved unless it's something that is sort of a slight exception to any rules. We are less involved in those, but I will circle back with, I think communications can be helpful too, because they provided a lot of information to the journalists that were doing some of those articles. But that might be something that we ask ISD to come give an overview on. It's not something that we can answer directly, just because of where the applications are coming in.
Anything else? I want to thank everybody for a good beginning to this conversation and this process. I didn't know where we were going to wind up, and I think, and then you guys tell me. Do you think this was productive? Is this where we were hoping this kind of discussion would go?
I thought it was great. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely, Mr. Chair. It was a good conversation.
Good. Yeah, that's what we're trying to do, and haven't done it before, so still trying to figure out what works and what makes people feel like their thoughts and ideas are heard and valued and discussed. So awesome. See no other business before the planning board at 7:36. The chair moves to adjourn. Seconded by Amelia. Steve, could I have a roll call, please?
Sure. Jahan Habib,
Aye.
Luke Schuster,
Aye.
Michael McNeely,
Aye.
Amelia Abel.
Aye.
And Michael Capuano.
Aye. Thank you all very much. I'll see you in a couple of weeks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.